I will start by saying good afternoon, everyone, and to welcome you to a new series of our webinars. This time, we're going to enter a deep discussion on the natural capital, specifically looking at how Europe is rewarding, also financing and protecting our natural capital. For those that don't know me, I'm Claudia Costa. I'm the Academy Director of Food for Sustainability, and as usual, I will be your moderator for the session today. Today, that we address a critical issue for Europe and also beyond Europe. We are also joined by three great panelists that I will introduce in a second, and I hope that you enjoy your time with us. And thank you again for being here. So what do we bring to the table this time? Uh, One thing that we are very aware is that Europe has a lot of language about, in terms of policy, specifically about nature. But I think what it really matters is whether we are creating the right incentives, the funding instruments, and the market signals that are actually changing behavior. And we mean behavioral change in terms of our farms, our companies, our financial institutions, and also the public institutions, because we know in the end, policy alone does not transform landscapes. And this is where the debate starts to be interesting. We need to question whether we are really seeing a shift from intention to impact, whether these public fundings, private capital, and new market mechanisms are really actually starting to bring rewards to those that restore and protect nature, and look specifically at tools such as the biodiversity credits, whether they are becoming credible enough to connect the ecological value with the financial value in a meaningful way for investors and practitioners. And as we move along in this debate, we know that these are not abstract questions. They actually go to the heart of Europe's ambition to build a more resilient and competitive nature positive future. Because one of the things that we are already witnessing is that biodiversity loss, soil degradation, water stress, and also some climate pressure are already in the present reshaping the conditions under which our food systems and rural territories operate. So this is where we bring, is the starting point of our debate. And let me just remind you that here at Food for Sustainability, we try to turn this vision into practice. Some of our tools, our Regenerative lab in north of Lisbon, which is our soil health and function laboratory, where we analyze all the soil microbiome, we quantify, we measure, in order to ensure that we provide tailor-made decisions to farmers. Also, Ampliaqua, our multi-trophic integrated system where we produce microalgae, fish and vegetables, but also where we produce some of the biostimulants that are so needed to ensure that our natural capital works to the full potential. And also our Idenha Rural Food Park, where we have this living lab that connect research, innovation, and the territory in living space. Here, regenerative solutions are tested, observed, and scaled. So these are really not just facilities. Sorry. What we have here is a group of platforms that allow us to act, to learn, and to collaborate with all the stakeholders in the agri-food system. And also to remind you that this is the spirit of our Healthy Soil for Life program. Here we bring together knowledge, training, and practice to support healthier soils, stronger ecosystems, and of course, working towards a more resilient agri-food system. So if you are interested, if you want to know a little bit more, please use our QR code to know exactly what we have prepared for you. And I can tell you that you can either join online through week 1 and week 2, where we address the basics of a resilient soil systems, but also how resilient and healthy soil relates to art, to taste, to digital tools, to farmers and other tools. And then in the third week, we have a very intensive, immersive program. So please check, see what's learning opportunities suits you best. And I really hope to see you all in the summer to learn, to have fun, and of course to dive in this wonderful, beautiful swimming pool. So I believe the team also has the link to this program in the chat, see if it is easier for you. But going back to our session today, I'm really, really pleased to welcome 3 speakers that will bring distinct but highly complementary perspectives on the conversation we are just about to start. So I will start to present very briefly Emma Donald. She's a cultural, economic, and environmental anthropologist. She specializes in food systems, agriculture, biodiversity, and global markets. So Emma brings a critical lenses on how value is defined, also how value is negotiated and translated across food and nature systems. Thank you so much, Emma, for your time here with us. Also, very pleased to welcome in our webinars corner Diana Vieira. She's a researcher at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. She specializes in soil health, land degradation, and EU soil monitoring. Diana will help us ground this debate in the evidence base and also in the policy and monitoring realities that shape Europe's action on soil. Diana, it's also a pleasure for us to have you here. And finally, we will be joined by Nuno Oliveira. Nuno is the CEO and the co-founder of NBI, Natural Business Intelligence. And Nuno works at the interface of biodiversity, natural capital, and regenerative business models. Nuno will help us explore how nature can be made intrinsic to business and finance decisions and what this means for credible biodiversity markets. Nuno, it's also a pleasure to have you here with us. So after this very short introduction, I will start by asking the team to put our Slido slide up so that we can all join in a moment. In the meanwhile, I will just remind you some of the house rules that we have here every time that we run our webinars. So as you know, these webinars are recorded. So if you're not comfortable with these, just ask you to put your cameras off. Questions are, of course, and always very welcome. We'll ask you to place your questions either in Slido through the Slido. You have a tab where you can have your questions, or if you're more comfortable, please use the chat here in Teams. We'll also address your questions to our speakers. Very briefly, as always, you know, you can get your certificates at the end of the sessions. To get your certificate, all you need to do is to answer 3 very simple questions that are related to the topic and the subject that we are discussing here today. After this, we will issue a certificate. We know that for some of you, this certificate, it's important. So please stay a little bit longer. A part of enjoying the lovely speakers that we have here, you also have the opportunity to fill in this questionnaire. Okay, thank you so much. So we already have Slido here on board. You know how Slido works. I kindly ask you to join through our QR code or simply with a browser in your tab. You know how to do it, www.slido.com. F for S Academy in the hashtag box. So here we go for a few questions about the natural capital in Europe and beyond. So the first question relates to the percentage of EU soils that are considered unhealthy or degraded. This is a number that has been coming up very, very often in the discussions, but it's always very important to remind us the state of soils in Europe. So we have here the option. Thanks so much for voting. Now we have a tie. We definitely need one more vote. Thank you. So we have the figures of 50 and 30%. Unfortunately, soil degradation in Europe is far more widespread than many people realize. So we are talking a figure higher than 30%. We also have the figure of 90%. We can say that the state of soils in Europe is serious, but not as serious to be considered at a catastrophic level. So it's lower than 90%. So this means that soil degradation, we know it affects food production, biodiversity, water retention, nutrient cycling, and climate resilience. This is one of the key reasons why Europe is advancing stronger soil monitoring and restoration policies. Healthy soils are increasingly recognized as essential infrastructures for resilient food systems. And currently, Europe, and you're absolutely right, has around 60 to 70% of its soils considered unhealthy, according to the European Commission assessment. This is a very high figure and should always make us aware that we need to do something. Thank you so much for taking part. Well done. Let's go to the second question. Do you know what nature credits are really trying to reward? So Europe has set up a roadmap for the nature credits. What is Europe trying to reward? Lower food production, ecosystem benefits, farm automation, and or export quotas. So we started with lower food production. Nature credits are designed to work alongside productive farm systems, okay? Not to replace them. So it's definitely not lower food production. No one also selected farm automation. We know that a lot of these digital tools may support monitoring, but automation in this case is not the goal itself. And also export quotas. So we know that nature credits are not related with trade quotas. They actually aim to create financial value for measurable outcomes such as biodiversity restoration, soil regeneration, carbon sequestration, and water protection. So the idea is very simple, but can say that it's very powerful. Nature credits want to reward farmers not only for what they grow, but also for the ecological functions they restore and maintain. So well done. We are really trying to reward ecosystems benefits. So this is important to bear in mind. There is kind of a shift from the way Europe rewards farmers. Thank you so much. I believe we still have one other question. Yes, and it's up this question. So what is Europe increasingly asking farmers to deliver besides food? More standardized landscape ecosystem services, fewer natural habitats, or higher fertilizer rates. And it's again all these points are important to bring in context the discussion that we are bringing to the table here. So besides producing food, Europe is not trying to shift to more standardized landscape. The trend is actually towards more resilient and multifunctional landscape. Biodiversity protection is becoming more central, not less. So it's not about fewer natural habitats. And also fertilizers policy, EU policy is increasingly focusing on reducing this dependency on external inputs. So I think we all also have a consensus in this question. So Europe agriculture policy is increasingly recognizing that farmers do much more than producing food. Healthy agriculture systems can also store carbon, protect biodiversity, regulate water, improve soil health, and also strengthen climate resilience. Where is the big shift? It's because farmers are increasingly being valued not only for what they produce, but also for the ecosystem they maintain. They help to maintain. So thank you so much. It's indeed ecosystem services that EU is trying is asking farmers to do more and more and more. And we also, all of us as a society, should do more and more is to protect the natural capital that we all so much rely upon. Thank you so much for taking part. I think this was a very good warm up. Also, thank you, the team, to prepare this question. So I think we are now ready to start our discussion. So I will kindly ask Diana. Hello, Diana, to come to our digital stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody that is attending to this webinar. Okay, let me see my time. And yes, my name is Diana Vieira. I'm Portuguese working at the Commission. I hope you see my screen.
Yes, we
Yes,
do.
you're
All
nodding.
good.
Yes, very good. And yes, I wanted to give an overview for the newly approved soil monitoring law, for which all of us, but specifically my team at the Joint Research Centre, has provided inputs for its development and now on implementation. I think it's worth to speak or to say, at least, I don't know very well the audience, but it's important and relevant to say what type of research center is this one that I'm working on. I work in the EU Soil Observatory at the JRC, and this is a scientific research center that is dedicated to provide policy advisory. So whenever a law is provided and whenever we need us at the decision making at the European level, we provide scientific advice to the policymakers, and we engage with member states depending on the circumstances, but in this case you will see on the development of the law. And my team, which is the EU Soil Observatory, you can find us online, and we are basically one of the largest providers of soil data that you can find worldwide. We have data that is in great part originally from the Lucas survey, which is a massive survey of soil sampling that currently should have around 40,000 points, and all over EU. And we do our own research. We have platforms to talk with citizens and citizen engagement, literacy. We do the soil monitoring. We have our data sets always available. And we also have some dashboards on the state of soils in EU, at least at this moment, a version of it. And of course, all of this altogether serves to provide knowledge for soil policy. And this is one of the most beautiful drawings we got in the European Mission Soil Week, when I think this was in Spain. And yes, and we also do have some emphasis on engaging with the scientific community, especially young researchers, to try to cherish for the new generations of researchers and be up to the challenge. So we are all this because soils are so multidisciplinary, and we need a lot of people with a significant background to provide as advice. I don't, when I present this work is on behalf of my team. I don't know all, I don't have all the knowledge on soils regarding several items or indicators that I will provide you. But you should be aware that this could not be possible without a multidisciplinary team. So, as an introduction for the soil monitoring law, some of you might have heard, but it entered into force last December, and now we came to the time that we need to wrap up in member states and try to produce the documents at national legislation. But until then, this came out, the policies considering soil, this scheme came out with the soil strategy in 2021, where we could see that soils were the base of so many other policies at EU level, and they underpin most of these policies on the Green Deal. So basically, we had a soil strategy in 2021, shortly after I arrived at work here, and we work on this proposal, and by 2023 we had the proposal for soil monitoring and resilience, and then by November, we got finally the acceptance after the discussions between the Council and the Parliament. And I decided to put the Portuguese version here because it's not always that you see our work translated in the, you always have to have original languages, so I find it very interesting for me, and very strange to reread everything then again in Portuguese, but still cool enough. So, what underpins this soil monitoring law? We all know this. I expect that the people in this audience understand the concepts of ecosystem services and the damage we can do to soils, or intentionally or not, or just because it's our need. It's trade-offs that we have all over our use. So we know the ecosystem services that soils provide in all levels, but we also should be very conscious of the threats that we impose to soils. And this is a very difficult balance to have, and we try under scientific evidence to try to give answers to all these threats to soil in the team. And one of the first, I missed that slide here, but one of the first questions when we were developing the soil monitoring law that came were how many of our soils are actually degraded or under threat. And if you go to our dashboard, you can look to this, what we call it, convergence of evidence that overlaps a series of data sets that indicates soil degradation. And with the reddish color, you'll find areas for which you have more processes occurring simultaneously of degradation. And by green, do not necessarily mean it's a healthy soil, but rather that we are not aware of any, in a data set, any degradation process occurring in this location. This is very relevant because we always assume that we know a lot, we have a good knowledge, but we need to develop so much other knowledges in terms of soil degradations. So what does this soil obliges? Basically, it defines a framework for the monitoring of all soils across the Union. And the objective is that when you see it with the data that we collect, you realize and you identify areas that need have some concerns, and we should address those concerns. This is to trigger a movement, trigger a conscience on local data that will provide an action afterwards. And of course, the whole value of ecosystem services is there. And I like to put this very clear from the beginning, is that the questions of pollution are a little bit more complex, and we have a very clear division in what concerns diffuse pollution and what is a contaminated site. There are two different approaches to these circumstances, and this I like to bring clear from the beginning. I will just list a little bit of these indicators, but it's just for you to have some understanding that we have threshold or limit values that underline thresholds we want to keep at the EU level. We also have descriptors that will have thresholds, or as we call the target values at the member state level, and we have other descriptors that don't have criteria but a request for a monitoring. And then we go to sourcing and removals, which I will not approach in this presentation because it's not so much our contribution. In this law, you can also have methodologies for sampling points, field sampling, laboratorial analysis, and this, when the development was very clear law, when we proposed in the negotiation, the thing complicated a little bit, because then the Parliament and Council decided to add and remove other things. So what is in the proposal is not exactly what is now approved, so you should be aware of the last document. So one of the things the law implements and would like to request is that the data that is collected by member states will enter in a soil health portal where we can have a good perspective at the EU level. How is the state of affairs in terms of soil health? And this is pretty much an image what our dashboard presents at the EU Soil Observatory. In this whole development that we have been doing until now, you have here a small design of the limit of some of the workflows of data that you can have between member states, between EEA, between GRC, that says that this is rather a complicated business, and we are working very hard over the last months to try to have this already for implementation phase. And one thing that we are working currently is that we already had some thresholds at EU level, but then we have to provide some guidance to determine at member state levels other thresholds, target values. We have to clarify and support the methods, choices between member states for all. And for instance, I'm creating the contamination, the indicative list of soil contamination for member states to choose, which is also a very complicated file. We have a general understanding that we should have a target value that could be works. So you have a limit value that you should not pass, a little bit to give you a classification of health, but we can have an operational target values that can assume different formats, because we have such a varied type of indicators that need to be adjusted to all these conditions. And finally, to make it really clear, to make sure I don't take much more time than I am expected to, we are still working together with member states on the point selection, sampling procedure, laboratorial guidelines, and here is for the future the thing I would like to bring, which is for me one very relevant, is that this law is expected to be re-evaluated by 2033, which means that the first runs we do will also serve to understand if we are going in the right direction as intended, and therefore it is very important that people give the feedback once the monitoring is taken in place, and we can readjust what is necessary in a given time. And I hope I'm in my time and I finished now, and I would like to ask for questions if it's possible.
Yes, Diana, thank you so much for bringing such a clear and simplified overview of such an important law. That's it's very good, and it's good that we know that Europe is concerned about the states of our soils. Um, One of the things that I would like to, more clarification is how is this monitoring and evaluation being financed by the EU? So who bears the burden of all this monitoring? Is it the farmers? Can you give a little bit more details on
Mhm.
it?
Within also what is possible to do right now. So basically, we have a share of the sampling and the lab analysis that are supposed to be contributed by the Commission, as also all our supporting guidelines. But member states should organize themselves, and the governments should make money available for sampling, analysis, and so on and so forth. So there will be a moment that you can choose to have more or less pollutants, for instance, for different levels of ambition for given member states. If you want to go further, you should go that further, but possibly this will inherently bring more costs. One thing that we don't want to do is to raise costs for farmers. Quite the contrary, what we want is to provide the data back so they can make better choices on the land management on their land. This is very clear. We are here to help, not to create extra burden. And finally, one thing that in others talks people have raised quite often is about how much this costs, because it's already some money. But I always make this comparison with satellite remote sensing that has a huge investment in the last years, and given the fact that we neglect soil for so many years, I think it's worth the investment.
Okay, thank you for this explanation. It's really important that we have these figures, that we know exactly where we are. Actually, just to mention, I was very curious about those green dots around Portugal, which I found a bit surprising, especially in the south, where we have so many severe problems with desertification and climate change. But
Mhm.
that's another conversation. So the point is, we do have a clear picture of how Europe is standing in terms of soil degradation. We are asking farmers to monitor the evolution of the condition of their soil, and then what? So
And then,
imagine, and then
yes,
what? So we have all
and
this.
we then collect the data, get the data together, look at the data, and each member state should analyze and make their first assessment. Like the first time is going to be very, very difficult for us to align everything, but then we should do the assessment in each of our areas. The data will tell us which type of problem we have. Is it a pollution problem? Is it an erosion problem? And member states should define their own strategies to remediate areas that they need remediation, restore areas that need restoration, and so on and so forth. So this is the trigger. We collect the data, we look at it, and then we decide how to act, because each indicator gives you a different guidance on the land management that you take. So the objective is this, is that we all together do evidence-based decisions.
Yes, and that's
Is
definitely very important regarding, specifically regarding soils. That, as you mentioned, not a lot of people is aware. And also, if we look, for example, a very interesting number someone was giving the other day is the number of calls in Europe that specifically mention the world soil. It's a lot about environment. That's a lot about restoration, but specifically soils, which give us an indication education, that eventually we still need more awareness of soils. But Diana, very conscious of time, and because we have a question from our audience, I will just ask you one final question. Will the monitoring frameworks be aligned to existing systems which pays farmers to restore soil carbon, such as, for example, the soil capital?
Like CAP, yes, in the European Commission or the EU, you should do laws, or in this case, a monitoring framework that is aligned with other policies. And we should be aligned with a nature regulation law, with or the nature restoration regulation. I mean, with also the guidelines for farmers under the CAP. So in principle, this is all aligned. It is possible that during these 2 years, the integration might be harder, but once it's established for the first time, yes, in principle, everything is aligned. The carbon is a very particular indicator. Actually, now has several indicators for which attracts a lot of attention, but it feeds into several other legislations, and it's the alignment, and actually we intend to collect data for other laws under the soil monitoring law, so to make only one sampling and not as many.
It makes
But
sense
I
because
hope I
everything
answered.
it's related, isn't it? The
Yes.
nature doesn't work in silos. It's all an entire well functioning system. Diana, thank you so much, and I think you raised so much important questions in your final slide. I really would like to know a little bit more, but eventually we'll have another discussion in a future webinar. Now we need to move on because we also have Emma that is joining us from the US. She's also going to mention a very interesting topic about the way we look at certain foods. Let's see what Emma brings to us. Hello, Emma.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Let me pull up my slides. Can I get a thumbs up, Claudia, that you can see the
Yes,
slides?
yeah.
Okay,
All
wonderful.
good from this end. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I am going to be talking today about neglected and underutilized crop species, which seems a bit far afield from soil health, but actually is not, because many neglected crop species, one of their kind of features is that many of them are sort of adapted to low input agricultural systems and like what we would consider sort of low quality soils. They're crops that grow in conditions that many other crops don't thrive in. So anyways, making that little connection with the previous presentation that was so fascinating. So I'm going to present today part of a chapter that I wrote for a policy report. The larger policy report was called The Elephant at the Table, and the goal of this policy report is to both better understand and analyze, but also make policy recommendations that confront the ways that power inequities in our food system often prevent the transformations that we want to see happen. So in many cases, we have the kind of information that we need, but the power dynamics in food policy spaces, et cetera, prevent us from realizing these kind of bold transformations in our food systems. Okay. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to introduce neglected and underutilized crop species and provide a brief history. And then I'm going to talk about drivers of their marginalization. And then towards the end, I'll talk about a few of the policy recommendations from my chapter in the report. And later I'll pop the link into the chat in case you're interested in learning more about what's in this policy report. Okay. So the concept of the neglected species first develops in the 1970s as one of several alternative agricultural development paradigms emerging at the time that critique the Green Revolution in different ways. So these early neglected species advocates were development practitioners and sometimes researchers who were growing concerned about the risks of increasingly monocultural production systems, and then with that, a global food supply that relied on fewer and fewer species. So this volume pictured here was the first effort to elaborate the neglected species concept. It was published by the US National Academy of Sciences in 1975. And in it, the authors warned that the world's reliance on just a few crops was begging disaster. And they urged researchers to turn their attention to the many, quote unquote, little known plant species that scientists had barely studied. So you can see here in the table of contents, the species that they selected as representatives of neglected species. And it's important to note that these species already had researcher advocates within their countries of origin in most cases. And so what this concept of the neglected species did was create a language for lumping together species as diverse as amaranth and durian fruit, which on the surface have basically nothing in common agronomically or otherwise. And it can be seen as an example of what we might today call North-South collaboration, as the contributors were really from all across the world. And I want to point out that not all of these species, but a handful today are marketed in upscale supermarkets as superfoods. As you can see from this quote on the first page of that text, they were explicitly critical of the politics of scientific knowledge production, especially how the vast majority of agricultural research funding had focused on just a few crops. And so in some sense, the ways that power shapes food systems was embedded in the neglected and underutilized species framing from the very beginning. And I will use this acronym NEWS, neglected and underutilized species, throughout the presentation. So for these folks, the same agricultural systems that the Green Revolution was destroying in the name of progress contain the key to feeding a growing global population. So indigenous farming landscapes were not primitive vestiges of a bygone era, but critical reservoirs of underexploited plants. A couple of things to note is first that the early neglected species advocacy was, of course, progressive in challenging taken for granted ideas about agricultural development. And at the same time, it was not calling for an overhaul of the existing agricultural research and development apparatus, but rather the incorporation of more species into its ambit. So according to this framing, what these species lacked to fulfill their potential was scientific research, more studies, more attention from plant breeders, more interest from agricultural input companies. And then second, this idea remains at the fringes of agricultural development for decades, for a long time. And so while there were a growing number of people thinking about their research through this lens in the 1980s and 90s, they really struggled to find funding or institutional support for this work. So there is no single agreed upon definition of noose, nor is there a clear boundary as to which species do or do not count. But in short, they're species that have received little attention from researchers, development initiatives, and policymakers when compared to major commodity crops. So they often have impressive nutritional profiles. They often thrive in really harsh environmental conditions, marginal soils, and low-put agricultural systems in general. In many cases, they're quite culturally significant and are embedded in local agroecologies. So over the years, there have been many terms used to refer to what are really a quite similar suite of species, as you can see here. These are just all of the different kind of roughly synonyms that have been used to refer to neglected species over the years. So noose is not an objective category, but a position defined against the conventional staple crop. So it's in some sense simply the foil of the conventional crop, which is itself, of course, shaped by histories of colonialism, crop promotion, development paradigms, funding priorities, and the rise of a global food industry based on logics of capital accumulation and standardization that ultimately require the exclusion and marginalization of other crops. So their defining feature is unrealized potential, agronomic, nutritional, and economic, which raises a question of potential for what? And potential for who? And this is something that I'll circle back to in a moment. So fast forward a few decades, and noose is no longer a fringe idea, and even some of the same agencies that underwrote the Green Revolution are now spearheading noose initiatives. And of course, this is really exciting to see support for these kinds of crops that have so long been marginalized. But at the same time, we've seen many agricultural development miracle crops go in and out of vogue over the decades. We can think of famous examples like Norman Borlaug's dwarf wheat varieties or golden rice as purported miracle crops of earlier development paradigms, insofar as they were pitched as these panaceas, and they also reflected and even legitimized the dominant development models and concerns at the time. So, as some scholars argue, these sorts of miracle crops can depoliticize issues like global hunger by focusing our attention on a sort of cure or what appears as a simple solution while distracting from more challenging questions like why people are undernourished in the first place. And so today, when issues of climate change adaptation, biodiversity loss, and indigenous knowledge are front and center in development priorities, I think it's not far-fetched to argue that noose are positioned as the sort of miracle crops of the 2020s. And I don't mean to make a simple equivalency between noose and golden rice. Obviously, there are many important differences, but I also think that this should give us pause and push us to reflect on how noose can either be incorporated into existing agricultural development apparatuses in ways that don't fundamentally challenge it, or could be drivers of structural transformation. And this tension, I think, is really essential. So this increased support for neglected species raises concerns about commercialization, elite appropriation, biopiracy, co-optation, and the risk of marginalizing traditional growers of the species in question. So in this report, we argue that an overly technical approach to noose combined with contradictory visions of the future of these species can undermine their far-reaching potential. So many of the drivers of their marginalization, meaning like what drives the neglect and marginalization of these species, they're well established and these have been covered widely. So by and large, it's the same factors that have driven a very small number of crops to play dramatically outsized roles in our food systems that have marginalized and undermined these other species. And similarly, the same factors that undermine small-scale agroecological farming in general undermine noose. So again, they're sort of the inverse of the conventional crop. So many of these dynamics are likely familiar to us, right? The subsidies and financial incentives that many countries give for staple crop production. In many contexts, policies and financial support for export-focused agriculture. We have aggressive marketing of ultra-processed foods, often unregulated. So anyways, these are drivers of larger changes in food systems. So a couple of things I'd like to emphasize is one, this last point in the list, that really there's money to be made in marginalizing noose, that private industry benefits from their marginalization because it ultimately creates new consumers for agricultural inputs and new consumers for ultra-processed foods. But more important is that these crops are neglected because the people who produce and consume them have been neglected. So communities that cultivate noose are among the world's most marginalized in many cases, socially, economically, and politically. These crops are primarily grown by smallholder farmers, often women, sometimes indigenous or ethnic minority groups. And many of them have been pushed onto marginal lands due to historic land dispossession and even contemporary land grabbing. So noose persists today because these communities have sustained them despite limited access to land, water, infrastructure, credit, or political representation. So with that, efforts to mainstream these crops without addressing the resource and power inequities these producers face risks failing the farmers and are likely to reproduce some of the same dynamics that noose advocates have sought to challenge. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. So I want to point to a few key challenges and paradoxes. And the first is circling back to the different visions, the different kind of potentials that people see in neglected species and for whom. So neglected species are defined around potential, and often noose-focused policies and initiatives focus on mainstreaming or scaling up. But all of this is rather vague and raises the question of potential for what? Scaling up for who? Mainstreaming where? And even in the earliest noose reports, we see many different proposals about the proper future of noose. So this vagueness of the concept can allow different actors with different agendas and visions for the future of these species to collaborate under the umbrella of realizing the potential of the species. But sometimes these aims are incompatible. And this is something that became really clear with quinoa, and that's been the focus of my research. I'm an anthropologist. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my research is focused on neglected species and especially quinoa in the Peruvian highlands. So some quinoa advocates saw the grain as a future agro-export that would help alleviate rural poverty in the Andean highlands. Others envisioned it as solving malnutrition in the Andes. Still for others, they saw a future global malnutrition alleviation tool that should be produced outside South America. And then when climate change became a more pressing concern, it's become pitched as a climate change adaptation crop that could be integrated into arid environments across the world where existing crop portfolios are failing. But it became clear during the quinoa boom that these were incompatible futures. Because when quinoa's price skyrocketed, that was great for poor farmers in the Andes who were finally making good incomes from their quinoa. But it was bad for quinoa's role in local diets as a malnutrition palliative because it became inaccessible to under-resourced communities in the Andes. So for it to fulfill its potential alleviating malnutrition, the price needed to be low. But for it to alleviate rural poverty, the price needed to be high. And this was a really key paradox that I'll return to in a few moments. I also want to point out that quinoa's popularity among wealthy, health-conscious eaters did offer income opportunities for traditional farmers, but there were not protections preventing others from taking up quinoa production outside South America, where the crop is native. So quinoa is now produced all across the world, and during the boom, agribusinesses along Peru's coast took up quinoa production and far outcompeted the farmers in the highlands on yields. So for instance, a good quinoa yield in the Peruvian highlands is about 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Some of the producers along Peru's coast, who could do 2 harvests per year because they have such a temperate climate, they boasted 7,000 kilograms per hectare, so 7 times the yields. So this has to do with the substitutability of NUS. And when we think of it narrowly as just a crop disembedded from the social, political, and agroecological context. So we need to be careful about this issue of scalability because as we know, the industrial agricultural model is completely built around scalability, substitutability. And so we don't want to just replicate those dynamics while substituting slightly more nutritious or slightly more hardy neglected species. Adding to this issue of the vagueness of potential is that we often see a dominant approach to NUS that is highly technical in nature. So this means that it focuses on identifying and addressing discrete agronomic and economic hurdles to scaling up production and consumption. So we often see a focus on the crop itself or the supply chain narrowly. So for instance, NUS compendiums often list specific agronomic problems limiting each species, like low yields, and call on plant breeders to develop improved versions. We've seen efforts to sequence the genomes of NUS and isolate specific genes within them. And these technical challenges are real because there's been less funding for research and innovation on these species. But an overly technical approach can limit our vision and really isolate the crop from the conditions of production and consumption and keep us focused on these discrete obstacles to overcome rather than the structural dynamics that marginalize the crops and their producers and eaters in the first place. So incorporating NUS into the dominant development apparatuses for seed research and marketing is likely to entangle these improved NUS varieties in intellectual property considerations, which might undermine their ability to benefit existing NUS eaters and growers. And broadly, framing NUS as technical solutions without addressing the power structures that marginalize the farmers and eaters who rely on them will likely produce some of these same power inequities. Okay. So we now see an increasingly common trajectory from NUS to superfood, and the dynamics I just mentioned around the vagueness of potential and the technical approaches to promoting NUS really enable this. So quinoa is probably the most obvious example, but I know at my local Whole Foods, I can get a bag of fonio, teff, maca, and the supplements aisle has lots of products that were based in species historically considered to be noose. And this is a defining paradox for noose today, that under-resourced populations that historically relied on these species produce and consume less of them in many but not all contexts, while at the same time we see the rise of export-focused supply chains for some of these same species. And this is often pitched as a win-win. Farmers get to keep growing their ancestral crops and also make better incomes. But the pattern we see is more complex, and it doesn't necessarily end up benefiting these under-resourced farmers. This vision of the future of noose has a lot of economic and political power behind it. And while national level policies have tended to undermine noose and bolster staple and export crop production, we now see the rise of policies that support noose, but only insofar as they have potential as high-value superfood exports. So, for example, Peru's Ministry of Exterior Commerce launched the Superfoods Peru program in 2017 as part of an effort to promote the repackaging and export of various native Peruvian noose. And during the quinoa boom, Peru's Ministry of Agriculture put funding into developing the coastal quinoa production. And in fact, the growing interest in noose among agronomic research and food scientists has already resulted in thousands of patents and various biopiracy cases. So research from 2022 shows that patents and intellectual property related to Andean neglected species are overwhelmingly registered in non-Andean countries. So we need to be really careful about the biopiracy considerations at play. We've already seen biopiracy lawsuits related to quinoa, teff, rooibos, hoodia, both for seeds and processing techniques. So framing these noose initiatives around technical obstacles really enables this, and in some sense folds them into ongoing processes of enclosure that undermine their ability to serve traditional producers and consumers. Okay, so I want to just transition in the last couple of minutes to the policy recommendations. So we imagine for this policy report, noose not as high-value superfood exports, but as essential aspects of regional food systems that offer nutritious and culturally meaningful food while helping build robust and sustainable agricultural systems. But at the same time, we're very sympathetic to the context where small farmers want to export because it offers them the promise of higher incomes. And so resolving those kinds of tensions is one of our key goals. So there are 9 policy recommendations in the report, but I'm just going to touch on 4 really quickly. So the first circles back to the issue of noose being marginalized because the farmers and eaters are marginalized. So we have to figure out what resources the farmers need, and in many cases have been systematically excluded from. So not focusing so much on the crop itself, but these producers of the crop. This might be quality land or irrigation or harvesting technologies. And with that, we have to support collective action through cooperatives and farmer associations so that they can demand these things themselves. So noose don't have well-funded lobbying agencies like many crops do, but building collective power among producers can give them a voice to advocate for their needs. Second, we have to direct state investment away from export-oriented agriculture and towards domestic supplies of noose through subsidies and state procurement programs. There's some really hopeful cases with this in Brazil's school feeding programs and with the public procurement of millets in India. And these programs can help resolve this issue of needing prices low so the food remains accessible for all eaters, but also needing farmers to earn a decent living. So state procurement can keep prices stable while subsidies would ensure farmers are incentivized to produce these nutritious species and also can help these foods compete with cheap processed alternatives. We also have to resist the impulse to focus solely on formalization of supply chains and supply chains that lead to supermarkets. Most noose are already available in informal or traditional market settings. And they tend to be under-resourced markets that receive little support for refrigeration and infrastructure. So we need to support these informal vendors and markets that are already making these foods available and accessible to under-resourced populations. The last recommendation I'll touch on has to do with ideas about quality. So one issue that many noose have is that they have incredible intra-species diversity, which is great, but it's also a challenge for scaling up and for processing. So for quinoa, there's hundreds of varieties of quinoa with different agronomic characteristics, but only a few have come to be seen as commercial varieties. And in fact, the commercial varieties tend to be the least resilient, the least hardy varieties. So we don't want to just create monocultures with a new set of species. So we need to be careful about the relationships between agricultural biodiversity and quality standards, such that quality standards should be built with the farmers' needs and voices in mind. So I will just briefly conclude with 3 takeaways. The one is that newts are critical for resilient, nutritious, and culturally grounded food systems, but they remain marginalized by dominant agricultural models. The second is that technical solutions alone are insufficient for building the influence of newts, because the neglect of newts is fundamentally a power and equity issue. And then finally, transformative policy has to center community power, public investment, and local food security rather than export-led commercialization. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emma, for bringing such an interesting topic, addressing here the power dynamics in global food systems. I think this is really important, and also to show that this is a very complex issue. The agri-food system is indeed there are a lot of variables, and as you very rightly pointed, sometimes we are trying to promote good policies, but what happens is that we are destroying part of the mechanisms that we intended to be good in the beginning. And as you were describing the case of quinoa and in Peru, in Latin America, I was coming to my mind the Mediterranean diet system that is so dear to us, and is actually based on very particular species that we can see are being lost and being replaced by other crops that are indeed less resilient. They bring other health problems and well-being to the communities. For example, we have problems with the chickpeas, with our own native cereals. It's even harder to find the indigenous varieties for the olive trees here in Portugal. So it's also very good that Diana is here, and maybe we can have this chat later on, because we're just running slightly out of time, but I will bear this question. We just have a question here in the chat for you, a specific one, Emma. Maybe you can clarify when you're mentioning the nuts concept, so the neglected and underutilized species, if you are also refer, is it just plants, or is also endogenous fauna and also the native microorganisms such as fungi?
Yeah.
What is the remit of your concept?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the concept's been used in different ways, and some research have included, for instance, neglected livestock species and varieties that have been kind of marginalized as certain varieties, subspecies have become, the dominant species. Some people, have included, as is mentioned here, fungi. That's less common, but wild collected plants is another context that in some countries people consider to be part of this conversation. So for me, I focus on crops because I'm sort of focused on crop-based agricultural systems, but many people have used this concept to think about other kinds of species that our agricultural system has marginalized and undermined.
Yeah, because they are all interrelated, isn't it? For
Yeah.
example, going back to the Mediterranean diet, animals have always been part of the system. And what we are also seeing is that kind of the native underutilized animals
Yeah.
nowadays are being replaced by, kind of the standard species.
Yeah.
And then raises another.
Insects are another group of animals that are considered neglected species in many cases, as a neglected kind of protein source that in many places we don't use to the extent that we could.
Yes, or even as pollinators, that surely is also something very important. That's a very interesting topic, Emma, and I'm glad that you brought also insects and the pollinators, because we also have with us Nuno Oliveira. Is very passionate about this topic. Also, Nuno is going to address focus on the nature credits. Hello, Nuno. Cannot see you,
Yes,
but
I'm here.
yes, you're here. Nuno, thank you so much. Also, we already have done a brief introduction to you. So whenever you're ready, the digital floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Claudia. It was quite a challenge to be here today. So, but it's participate in this kind of discussions because definitely I only listened to Emma's presentation. I missed Diana's presentation, but I was very interested on her perspective on how these let's call them alternative foods also can function as a double-edged knife for the people that have them and for the market. It was quite challenging. So about challenging issues, I'm trying to share with you some ideas on the question of biodiversity credits and nature credits and how they can work, if they are real or not. And let's see what happens. Okay, so
And Nuno, allow me
yes,
just to also remind our audience, for those that are here in Portugal, that you're going to have a session just around nature credits. I know that you've been doing a lot of work. I don't know if
yeah,
it's worthwhile to share that with the
yes.
rest of the audience if they want to join the debate.
Mhm. I'll share in the chat the links for the sessions. There will be a session on Lisbon on the 20th with the Life Institute Global, that they are already working in biodiversity certification and issuing biodiversity credits, and another session on the 21st. So next week, so it's this week is going to be quite well,
Ethic.
hectic. Yes. Okay. So okay, let's go.
It's not in
Hopefully
presentation. Yes, it is in
you are seeing the
presentation mode.
presentation. Okay, great. So again, thank you so much, Claudia. I'm a real fan and supporter of the Food for Sustainability Collab and the work they have been developing for quite a few years now. I don't know how many, but they're not the new guys in town. They already know a lot about how this works. So let me tell you just a little bit about NBI, Natural Business Intelligence. We were founded in 2020, so 6 years old. So we are now entering elementary school, something like that. And we are a Portuguese consultancy company that somehow got convinced that ecology and economics are sisters, and they've been quite um, not getting along as much as they should, but they are now learning to how to cooperate more together. And we've been developing a series of projects regarding the different issues like natural capital, ecosystem services, ecological restoration, so on and so forth. This is our team. It's expanding. It's already a team of 15 people, so it's quite challenging to keep on track on everything we're doing by now. And these are just for you to have an idea, the kind of questions that we have from our clients. Um, we are not an environmental consultancy. We are what we are a natural economy consultancy. So we get the odd, tricky questions like, we want to build a portfolio of investments in natural capital, or we want to turn environmental liabilities into valuable assets, or we want to incorporate nature into business strategy, or we want to know how we can turn investment into measurable economic benefits. And the one of the most common of all is how to assess and how to value ecosystem services and put them on the balance sheet and on our business strategy. And for that, we developed a series of skills that are needed for the different kinds of markets, from natural capital valuation to a tool that we have developed at NBI, and as far as we know, it's quite exclusive from us, which is the ecological due diligence. Ecological due diligence is when someone has an estate or property and wants to know if carbon or biodiversity credits are feasible, what kind of ecological restoration project they should develop, how to integrate the natural capital value of their estate, being a farm or a forest plot or even urban areas, how can they integrate that into their risk management and opportunity management. We are also working quite a lot now with nature finance and credits, like it's going to be the topic of this presentation. Nature positive strategies with all those tools, CSRD, TNFD, DNFD, and so on and so forth, SPTN. So all those tools with weird names now that the many companies are obliged or pushed to develop, and working in restoration projects and also in training and thought leadership projects like the one that we are participating now, because sharing knowledge is increasing knowledge. And well, this is not news. But in fact, I'm not going to explore the numbers in detail. I just want to say that we often keep ignoring the economic value of nature, and we quite fast come into a conclusion that it's always larger than zero, which is strange because we often treat the nature as valuing zero unless we can extract something from it, or we can cut/burn it something from nature. But nature does much more than that. Nature provides us with regulation processes like soil maintenance, that I believe it was Diana's presentation, air and water purification, climate disease control, the whole issue now about the non-conventional food plants, and all the issues regarding also carbon sequestration, so on and so forth, and cultural services, which is to say that, in fact, for us, for humankind, it is important to value recreational, tourist, spiritual, aesthetic value of natures. The point is, often when we are looking at the business models that we value the most are the ones that value the less nature, and they are driving this increasing pressure on the natural capital, especially on what we call the public benefits and goods from natural capital. So we have a kind of financial philosophy that in fact provides more benefits for the private appropriation of public goods and services and devalues public goods and services, and that is leading us to these extremes that we see about climate change and nature and degradation, ecological disturbance. But the point is, I'm going to not to focus because you don't have much time, so I'll try to be as focused as I can. There's a lot of issues about, is it possible to go beyond compliance? Is it possible to go beyond environmental risk assessment or environmental impact assessment and to create an economic and financial logic to investing in nature? Well, that is a large question, and one of the possible hypotheses is the biodiversity credits. So what are biodiversity credits? Often we'll be hearing about biodiversity and nature credits. They're more or less the same. So now I'll just try to simplify it and call them biodiversity credits, but we'll see that the EU tends to call it the nature credits, but it's more or less the same. No, they don't diverge significantly. So basically, what are we talking about? We're talking about a classic certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of a positive biodiversity outcome, and I should have underlined here positive biodiversity outcome, that it's durable, that it's additional to what we would have occurred if otherwise we didn't have the credits. This is like the general concept. And how we get to those concepts, how a biodiversity credit is made. See, nice acronym, made, right? So measured, of course. First you need to measure the outcome, to measure not only the additional outcome, but also, and I'm going to prevent the next leap from to A, Biodiversity credits are quite different from carbon credits at this point because they don't only value the additional the additional ecological value, but they also value the avoided loss of ecological value. So when we have an ecosystem of that has high conservation value, but business as usual is leading to degradation, avoiding degradation, avoided loss represents an opportunity for credits. Hence, the additionality, it's the ecological gain. And ecological gain, as I said, is not only what we get extra, it's also what we don't lose in the process. Because, well, that would be a long conversation, but one of the issue that matters most on carbon credits and why I think that carbon credits keep on failing expectations is because one fundamental issue, they don't value stock, which is kind of odd because if we have a full-grown forest that is blooming with biodiversity, it provides multi-billion ecosystem services and only adds a little bit of carbon every year, they say this is not good for credits because it doesn't provide additionality. That is one of the dumbest, stupid arguments I ever listened in my life, but we can discuss that on another day. Durable, of course, because durability is fundamental. We have to ensure that it's permanent and it has a build-up, and equitable. It's really important because there are lots of people in the planet, and some of them we tend to treat them as picturesque, as something that appears on the sidelines of history. But those people were fundamental. We call it what the native people of the planet. We should all be native, but some of us are a little bit more aggressive and colonial than others. And one issue that is really important and also led to multiple crises regarding carbon credits was particular this one, benefits shared with stewards, indigenous people and local communities. This is absolutely crucial to biodiversity credits to become a fair and viable financial tool for measuring and valuing nature. Okay, so how can we do it? First step is stewardship. Understanding who's the landowner, who's the farmer, the forester, the community, who can implement the actions in terms of ecological action, restoration, conservation, or improved management. Who's the steward of the land? Seems pretty obvious, but it really deserves some thinking. Measurement. One of the things that I hear a lot in many businesses and many political forum is the question that, carbon is really easy to measure. It's one indicator. Biodiversity, nobody knows how to measure biodiversity. It's very complicated. That's gaslighting. It is not that complicated. It's technical. And no, you don't have one ring to rule them all. For biodiversity, you need at least 3 indicators. You need who's there, how they are spread, and doing what, which is species, distribution, and ecosystem services, ecosystem functions. So it's a little bit technical, but I no longer can stand when someone says that we cannot move into biodiversity because it's too complicated. It's quite comfortable for some people that it is complicated, but we're not those people, are we? We're the people that want progress, that want a better economy, that want a better planet and a better future. Certification. Certification, why? Well, certification, it speaks for itself. It's the process that we have for creating accredited methodologies, like, for example, LIFE methodology that we are working with. There are other, and this is one of the methodologies that we believe the most. And the events in Lisbon and Porto will particularly focus on this methodology, but there are many other, and some of them are trickier than other, but I believe that certification is the pathway to ensure transparency and accuracy. Transaction. Well, having a credit means that you have something that has value and should have liquidity. If it doesn't have liquidity, it's not a credit. It's a token. It's nice to have. So transactionability is totally relevant for this aspect, and claim when a buyer buys a credit that should be retired from the market and should be properly reported using all those schemes that we've been talking about, like CSRD and TNFD and other that are relevant for the financial sector. This is quite straightforward. What are we talking about when we talk about the market? These days, the total voluntary biodiversity credits market transaction to date, to January 2026, is the freshest numbers I had to be sure, was less than 2 mil. So less than 2 million in credits. The point is, if we look at the projections from World Economic Forum or McKinsey or Biodiversity Credits Alliance, we see that we can have a projected annual demand by 2030 around 2 billion. And what we expect is by 2050, we'll have 69 billion or something like that. The numbers are just a proximal reading of it, what could be the market value. But what I really want to stress is, despite the fact that we can discuss these numbers, lower them or increase them, all of these numbers are way larger than zero. So we're not talking about a nice to have, we're talking about something that really has a market and that it's tradable and that has liquidity as far as we can work with. So how we see that the issue of nature credits has been progressing. So in 2022, we had the Kunming-Montreal agreement that launched the possibility of having the nature and biodiversity credits, but this is not that was not absolutely new. There was a lot of work done before, and for example, last year we had the EU Nature Credit Roadmap that was launched to create an European initiative. But once again, in Europe, we tend to have this perspective like we are the crème de la crème, the top cookie on the package. We are not. There are many people working on this subject, and whilst we are still discussing how to make nature credits, for example, in some other parts of the world, the credits are already being developed, sold, and bought. And we have banks involved, and we have financial sector involved, and we have insurances involved. So this is not something that Europe is going to tell the world how it is done. It's something that Europe should have the humility to learn with the rest of the world on how it can be done and how it can be implemented, so that in 2027 we have an EU market operational, working in EU space and outside of it. So these rules, I'm not going to get technical. This slide is just for orientation, and if someone wants to see the slides later, I'll be more than happy to share those with Claudia. So basically what we have is, first layer is EU regulatory, because we are looking at this issue from a EU perspective, which is logic from my perspective. So you have the Nature Credits Roadmap, you have the CRCF's regulation about carbon removal certification processes. We have lots of regulations that are making it viable and accountable. We have global guidance. Hopefully it will be reinforced by the COP at Yerevan in September, October, or November, something like that. And we are now working also in the national schemes, also trying to relate this with the nature restoration law, which is being deployed in all EU countries, and Portugal has to deliver a plan on how it will implement the nature restoration law by the 26th of August. That will be fun. Let's see how it happens. But basically, there's a trail to be blazed, and we are not in uncharted territory. We are quite aware of what should be done and how that can help us really to push forward a nature-based economic agenda. So how to make sure that we are building bankable biodiversity assets? We have to develop what we call a due diligence. In particular, at NBI, we've been working with this issue for a while, and we have developed a concrete methodology for ecological due diligence. For example, we are working with investment funds that ask us if if it's interesting to buy a certain terrain or how to invest in a particular land, and we're working with Gen Agri, we're working with ecological restoration of forestry, so on and so forth. So basically how to do it in a very simple way. Baseline. You need a baseline. Unless you have a baseline, it is impossible for you to say that it's getting better, it's getting worse, it's getting some. You need a baseline, and you need to measure it using intelligence. There's a lot of information these days. There's a lot of indicators. There's no need to go wild on measuring. It's because I really like this concept that it's better to be vaguely correct than precisely wrong. So don't spend $1 million measuring everything. Measure what needs to be measured and follow for the next step. Project. How to implement a project. How the project develops. What is the cost benefit of the project? How we can start a project in a softer way and make it increase the complexity over time. Don't go wild, just trying to do everything at once. Be practical, be intelligent, and certify. Certification is critical. Again, we have life methodology, we have alignment with CSRD, TNFD, we have alignment with other credit schemes, and finance. Quite important, right? Because unless we have financial plan for executing the biodiversity plan or the restoration plan or whatever we're executing, we will fail the goals, because unless we have gnomes or leprechauns hidden in a forest that will do the work for us, we need people. We need people with practical skills, with advanced skills, with local knowledge to help you implement the project. So finance is important because these people have strange habits, like they need food, they need shelter, they need electricity, and they need to pay for it. So we have to take that into consideration as well. So credits are real, right? Credits are already being issued, and the example I'm going to tell is about Life Institute. Was founded in 2009, is operational in more than 20 countries, is already issuing credits in Brazil and working that in those credits already in Mexico and Colombia, hopefully Africa, and hopefully in Portugal quite soon. It involves quite impactful companies like Itaipu, binational. Itaipu is one of the biggest energy producers in the world, Petrobras, Natura, Boticário, Cayman, so on and so forth. And the question is, these nature credits from the EU and the biodiversity credits from life are not exclusive. So we can have multiple perspectives on how to accommodate a pathway that will bring value into the credits and not create like a sporting event of A versus B and let's see who wins. That's not the intelligent way to go. And just to give you a practical perspective, this is the place called Reserva Natural Guaricica. It's a part of the Mata Atlântica biome in Paraná, in South Brazil. And this is the aspect of this area in 2000. So this area was heavily exploited in terms of farming and buffalo production for cattle production, buffalo for meat and milk. And there was a lot of logging and capturing wild animals for zoos and so on and so forth. And then they started a regeneration project and a restoration process, and having the perspective of carbon credits and biodiversity credits as something they should add to their account. This is the aspect in 2000. This is the aspect now. I don't know if you noticed the difference. I know that I should have made some indications where the differences are, because they might not be so visible. Who am I kidding? It's obvious, right? It's pretty obvious. And this is not just about biodiversity credits and nature and restoration. One thing that they really worked very well was people, local communities. So we had local communities that basically were very low, close to zero levels of literacy. So they provided literacy, they involved the people, they hired the people, and let's say that in areas where hope was not the most common ground, now we have people becoming forester engineers and economists, and the amount of money they are providing with the ICMS, which is a Brazilian tax that is delivered to conservation areas. The amount of the revenue that this area is generating is far larger than the revenue that was being generated by the buffalo and the cattle production. And people are better, and they have more jobs, and they are paid better, and they have more literacy, and the area looks like this. But this is a satellite view, so I'm going to show you a photograph that I took when I was there last week, and it looks like this. So this is what biodiversity credits look like. Okay, and that's it. I hope you liked the conversation, that you have many doubts. I have some as well, but undoubtedly nature has a way to mix with economy and make our lives better. I believe so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuno, again for an inspiring presentation and really highlighting that it's possible to look at things in a different way. I think it was also very interesting to have Diana, Emma, and your perspective, because it means that, Diana, you have a lot to take away also. How can we incorporate all of this in one single policy that help us to drive forwards healthier soil, more biodiversity, and actually preserve some of our underutilized foods that are, underlining cultural systems and communities, and a lot of the heritage that has been living here with us. Unfortunately, we reached the end of our webinar. I'm so sorry. I just would like to give two messages to our audience just really before we go. As I mentioned at the beginning, some of you are looking to complete the final assessment. I will ask the team to have here in the chat the link to the final assessment. I will briefly remind you that Food for Sustainability during the month of May has two special editions of some of the MOOCs that we are developing. So we now just launched one on pesticides, from pesticides to biosolutions. Have a look to see if you're interested. It's a special price for during May. We also have a special price for our course on soil microbiome analysis. I know that a lot of you have been working, asking for a Portuguese edition. Have a look at this course. And finally, on the 28th of May, we will be playing with you how to code your own footprint app. So if you want to understand how artificial intelligence can also be at the service of providing different apps that can assist you, looking after your soil, so your biodiversity or your carbon footprint, join us on the 28th of May, and we'll be doing some hands-on work with you on this matter. This is the final assessment, and just one final note, we will continue these discussions. I hope you have enjoyed these discussions. Real word of thank you to our speakers. It was a great pleasure to be here and to moderate this session. I know this conversation could go on and on. Hopefully, you will accept our invitation to continue this conversation at a later stage. Also to you that have been following us through this 1 hour and a half. Thank you very much. I hope you see us next week, same time, same place, to continue discussing how Europe is supporting natural capital. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to guide you this session. Bye-bye.